Hello everybody, welcome back to Millennial Meditations. This week I am not doing news for normies as I'm going to be out of town, so I'm recording this in advance. So with the current election cycle coming up, both Vice President Kamala Harris and her VP running mate Tim Walz have made comments that very much concern me. Kamala Harris, as the time of me recording this, has promised to enact price fixing when she is elected president. We all know that this is a communist practice, and communism doesn't work. Also, Tim Walz has been on record saying, quote, one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. So, with these things being said, I wanted to record this video as a rebuttal to communism and why it doesn't work. I love the Fat Electrician on YouTube and his undying quest to fight communism every time he can, and I feel a little compelled to do the same. So, with that being said, let's dive into what communism is, where it started, how many times it's been tried, and what resulted from it. Bit of a spoiler alert, if you are any history nerd whatsoever, you already know the outcome of this video. So, first off, communism has never and will never work, no matter how many times liberal white women claim it will. You know, you'll hear these so-called educated people say, oh, it's just never been tried correctly this time. Well, it's been tried numerous times and never worked, so I don't know how many times you have to repeat an experiment before you come to the conclusion it just doesn't work. In the 20th century, communism has been tried in several countries, most famously in the Soviet Union, which we would just kind of classify as just Russia nowadays, China, and North Korea. Those are just some of the three big ones, although there were smaller pockets of it in certain countries in Africa and Southeast Asia. So what is it? Communism is defined by Britannica.com as, quote, political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production, examples of mines, mills, and factories, and the natural resources of a society, end quote. Interestingly, Karl Marx, who was the brain father of communism, also tended to use the words communism and socialism interchangeably. So when, like I said, people like Tim Walz say that socialism is just people being neighborly, that throws up red flags to people like myself. So where did it start? Communism is the brainchild of one Karl Marx in the middle to late 19th century. Karl Marx was born in the year 1818 in Germany, but died in 1883 in London, England. Funny enough, he died in the place where the Industrial Revolution and capitalism really kind of started. So I find that highly ironic. Also, kind of just going from memory now, I believe that if you want to go visit the gravesite of one Karl Marx, you have to pay a small entry fee to do so. Very ironic if you ask me. So Karl Marx believed that capitalism would inevitably lead to basically a new form of slavery where the everyday worker would essentially work for slave wages in order to enrich greedy business tycoons. Those are my words, not his, but that was the general principle of what he believed in. Now, I can already hear people lighting up the comments section. Oh, well, capitalism has failed because people, can't afford to eat now and all this other stuff. Okay. I will admit that capitalism has its faults. And, the current state where we are in America of me recording this, yes, we do have a very large disparity between, you know, the CEOs and the C-level executives of giant corporations versus the frontline workers for those companies. However, at least in a capitalist society, you have opportunity to make something of yourself. People get famous on social media and end up super wealthy. Or somebody has an idea for a new product or a change for an existing product, and that lights a firestorm of change. I'm thinking, I don't know why this was the example that popped into my head, but the guy that thought of the flaming hot Cheeto, from what I know of that story, he was a janitor for the company where he worked for. Oh God, I'm blanking on the name of it. Somebody can correct me in the comments. But anyway, he was a janitor and then came up with the idea of a new flavor for Cheetos, and it went wild. People loved it. So you can't get that kind of stuff in a communist society. Not that, Cheetos is the epitome of capitalism, but it's an example. A guy that was working an everyday job had a great idea for something, and boom, he's changed the whole market for potato chip type snacks. Okay, I went on a bit of a tangent there. So yes, capitalism does have its faults, but capitalism has led to more prosperity for the majority of the people on this planet than communism ever has. And, I actually saw this statistic recently. Up until like the late 1800s, most people were just poor. Most people. You had a couple people that were extremely wealthy, or I wouldn't even say extremely wealthy, but they were just wealthy, and that was just the way it was. But then came the Industrial Revolution, and people had much more prosperity than they ever had. So, back to communism though. In a ideal communist utopia, everyone would operate under the principle of, quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, end quote, directly from Karl Marx. So you might be thinking to yourself, yeah, that sounds great. Everybody, works and pitches in, and everybody gets an equal share of food and resources, and everybody just leads a happy-go-lucky life and never has to worry about anything ever again. Well, sadly, that's not the case. The end result of communism in the 20th century was millions upon millions of people dead just from 1900 to 1999. Big examples of this, and that's not counting the wars that were fought from, in that century alone. We had this is not counting World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, any of the other wars and conflicts. This is solely about how communism alone killed millions of people. So, examples of this. There was a famine in Ukraine that most people call the Holodomor. If I'm pronouncing that wrong, don't care. We had the Great Leap Forward in China, which ironically didn't achieve a great leap forward for the country, and North Korea to this day. So, in the 20th century, quote, about 1/3 of the world's population lived under communist regimes. These regimes were characterized by the rule of a single party that tolerated no opposition and little dissent, end quote. That was from Britannica.com as well. And I want to pause here for a moment, and I want to ask you, who does this sound like in today's America? Does that truly sound like the Republican Party? Where Republicans want to bring back jobs to this country? and get Europe to pay their fair share in common defense like NATO? Or does it sound like the Democrat Party, who works hand in hand with big tech companies to censor people and shadow ban people who are critical of the Democrat Party and the federal government? Or college campuses that don't allow people like myself to hold conferences or rallies or protests? I'm going to spoil that one for you. That's not the Republican Party of today, okay? I'm not talking about what happened 20, 30 years ago. I'm talking about today. So, I gave 3 examples right up toward the beginning of this. Now it's time to kind of dive a little deeper into these. So, the Holodomor, which was a man-made famine in Ukraine due to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. This famine took place between 1932 to 1933 or 34. It's kind of debated when it kind of officially ended, but that was the general time span. So, what happened here? The Soviet government enacted collectivized agriculture in 1929, which meant the government forced people to relinquish their ownership of private land and property to collective farms, where people, who may or may not have been farmers, were forced to work the land to produce food. Because of this failed policy, unrest, riots, and armed rebellions started to take place in Ukraine. Imagine that. People start going hungry, their kids start getting emaciated and dying. People get very, very upset about that. It's almost like when a centralized governing body comes up with, harebrained ideas and it doesn't work, it's always the government's fault, even though they never want to take credit for that. So instead of doing the sensible thing and allowing people to grow their own food, because, people that have been doing it for a long time know how to do it, the Soviet regime came down with a heavy hand by blacklisting specific areas in Ukraine. What do I mean by this? These regions were given no food, no medical aid, no resources or supplies for people to live their day-to-day lives. They went so far as to allow police and communist leaders to ransack homes and villages for any foodstuffs they could find, to basically, punish these people even more, including taking their pets for food. So imagine somebody kicked in your door, stole the 2 cans of green beans you had, and took your dog and told you to thank them for doing it because it's, for the greater good. That's essentially what happened here. Because of these types of actions and the blacklisting of specific regions in Ukraine, about 5 million people died across the USSR alone due to starvation, with about 3.9 million of these people being from Ukraine. So, 80% of the people that died because of these failed centralized policies were in one country alone. During this time of unrest, too, the Soviet regime in Moscow saw this as an opportunity to attack the Ukrainian identity as a whole, targeting prominent Ukrainian officials in an attempt to topple long-standing pride in the nation. Again, who does that sound like today? Definitely not the Republican Party, at least, the America First types, but it definitely sounds like the Democrat Party, because they hate everything that our country stands for. And they want to take away the pride of America as well. So, at this point, I just regard the Democrat Party as a whole as the Communist Party of America, and I do not take them seriously, at least at face value. I know what they want will lead to this kind of stuff, but, just take this information with you next time your liberal friend or coworker starts talking about how, communism will be the answer for all of this. So I mentioned North Korea as well. North Korea has long been a communist state. and it is still that way to this day. Um, Kim Il-sung was the first communist dictator of North Korea and followed the traditional acts that any communist dictator did: collectivized agriculture and production, silencing of dissidents and political opposition, and mass murder to those who would oppose the state. Outside of the Korean War, which claimed the lives of roughly 2.5 million people, the Korean Communist state snuffed out between 710,000 to 3.5 million people. Similar to the Holodomor in Ukraine, these numbers are mere estimates due to communists not wanting to own up to their own crimes against humanity. Taking the average in North Korea, one can estimate that approximately 1.6 million people died just from the communists starving people to death. However, communists are known liars, so I am of the opinion that the higher body count is the one that is more accurate. Of course, government bureaucrats never want to admit that they are wrong, so they're going to try to make their actions seem, not as bad as it actually is. So that's why I'm of the opinion that, when these numbers come out of, oh, there was only 710,000 people dead, I would multiply that by like 3, because communists don't tell the truth. So finally, Mao Zedong, otherwise known as Chairman Mao, announced on October 1st, 1949, the foundation of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC for short. Mao had ideas on how to drastically launch China into the modern world by trying to rapidly outpace the West in production and agriculture, while also trying to propel this communist utopia forward. Sadly, Chairman Mao's ideas led to, you guessed it, mass starvation and death. Mao was able to rile up the masses by promising to reduce the cost of rent, redistributing farmland in a more equitable way, and collectivized production for workers. All things that communists always espouse and how they always say it'll work this time, it never does. Now, at first, it seemed like his policies would actually work, as the Chinese economy had expanded almost 9% every year during their first run of their 5-year plan. And they tried these 5-year plans as a way to gauge how the country's doing and move things forward. So the first 5-year plan, things seem to be going pretty good. On top of the economy expanding like this every year, life expectancy increased about 20 years for the average Chinese people between the years of 1949 and 1957. So in 8 years, the average life expectancy increased by about 20 years. So that's great. However, in 1958, during the second rollout of a 5-year plan, also known today as the Great Leap Forward, farmers were not only tasked with just farming, but also producing steel as well. One of the big things that Chairman Mao wanted to do was outproduce the West in steel production. This was supposed to be achieved by large communal living spaces with roughly 5,500 occupants in one commune. The people living there would work side by side in the fields, leaving their young children in communal nurseries and elderly people in communal homes, with the workers being fed by like makeshift food kitchens, sometimes even popped up in the middle of the fields, so that way it would reduce time of travel for workers to go get food and keep working. I don't know about you, but that sounds absolutely horrible to me, that you can't even take, half an hour to get a lunch break. Like, if it wasn't for capitalism, the 8-hour workday wouldn't have come around, and the idea of getting a lunch break in the middle of your day wouldn't have come around either. So, if people think this is a good idea, you gotta be crazy. Oh, alrighty, so, back on my notes. While this sounds good in theory, this caused about 10% of China's forests to be cut down. because you need food, or you need wood for fire to, cook with. And also, while the farmers were tending the fields, they would make their own makeshift furnaces to melt down any kind of metal that they could to produce as much steel as was required by the Communist Party. So you've got fuel going for cooking and melting down steel. So yeah, of course, wood is going to get used up. So with these policies being enacted, ignorance from city officials inevitably led to poor farming techniques and bad steel manufacturing practices, leading to rural party leaders reporting inflated numbers of production for steel and food, which then brought about higher tax requirements to be paid by those regions. So, even though the food wasn't there, it still had to get taken up, and that's a recipe for disaster. So starting in late 1959, peasants began dying from hunger and starvation because all their food was taken for the good of the party. Again, estimates here are wildly unclear as to the actual number of people dead, but the official estimates are between 3 million and 55 million people dead from starvation and hunger. Again, I repeat myself, I'm inclined to believe that the higher numbers here are more believable because the communists don't want to admit that they are actually wrong. So the most agreed upon figure from China's great failed communism was 30 million people dead, but I would be more inclined to believe 40 plus million people are dead because they fudged the numbers. So to summarize, communism took over much of the Eastern Hemisphere in the 20th century, resulting in death tolls between 8.71 to 63.5 million people dead just between these three countries alone. This figure doesn't include smaller nations such as Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, or the several African nations that tried to adopt communism as well. So, again, I'm reiterating this fact from the top. Be careful who you vote for in this upcoming election here in America. As I record this, it is August 18th of 2024. We have two major choices for our president and vice president starting in January of 2025. We have Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, both whom want to bring an America First agenda back to the board. We saw during Donald Trump's first term, the economic policies he enacted actually helped the average day worker, and not just, the greedy oligarchs in this country. On average, people were making about $5,000 more per year than they were under the previous administration before Donald Trump. However, you have people like Kamala Harris and Tim Walz who have espoused blatantly communist ideas and rhetoric, and they are the frontrunners for the Democrat Party to be president and vice president. So I hope you take this as a learning experience. Learn from history, my friends, and let's not repeat it here in the United States. As we record this, the United States population is about 350 million-ish. If you like to have food in your cabinet and gas in your car and want to go on vacations every once in a while, my guess is that Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are not going to be the VPs that do that. So take this as a warning, friends. If you haven't, go read books like 1984 and what was it, Fahrenheit 451, and take those as warnings as well. So with that, I thank you for watching this video. If you learned something new, hit the like button, share it with your friends. Let me know what you learned from this video down in the comments below, and I will see you all next time.